Thank you again for attending the Chamber's Global Forum on Economic Recovery. Over the past 2 days, we've heard from leading voices in the United States and around the world on what it will take to move beyond the challenges we've faced this past year. The public health and economic crises brought on by COVID-19 have affected every corner of the globe, and the solutions to overcome them must be global as well. Next, we're delighted to welcome a leading voice on many of the topics we've explored during this forum. Bill Gates needs no introduction. He's a renowned business leader and one of the most impactful philanthropists in the world. We have a lot we want to ask him, so let's get right to it. So here we have signs of recovery in some corners of the world, but we're also witnessing just a terrible crisis unfold in India, which, as you well know, could quickly spread to other countries. We've seen the power of public-private partnerships, including the work of your foundation, to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, and that's certainly the case with India right now. What lessons are you taking, should we all take, from the current situation that we can apply when the next crisis hits?
Well, in terms of pandemics, it wasn't high enough on the list of things that we practiced for and had a clear script on what we would do when it struck. And so it got, up into very high levels. And sadly, our only way of stopping that spread was to reduce economic activity, including things like school. So, the deficits that we created will be digging out of for a long time. The good news is that the innovation, particularly on vaccines, was faster than ever, even faster than people like Dr. Fauci and myself led people to expect. So within a year of the time of seeing the virus and knowing its sequence, several companies, starting with Pfizer and Moderna, had vaccines that have proven to be incredibly effective and are now getting out in very large numbers. So the lights at the end of the tunnel, we still see in the U.S. Often more than 500 people dying a day. So until we get those vaccine numbers up close to 80%, we're still going to have significant pockets of disease. But we've learned about innovation and collaboration. I can say with great certainty, we've learned a lot that will help us for the next pandemic. And by making some investments in R&D and in having factories available, having surveillance and a big team of experts on a global basis, we will next time handle something like this without anywhere near the damage that we had to go through.
Well, we certainly are all pulling for that. When you think about health systems, and globally health systems, what investments do you think are going to be necessary to make that true?
Well, the two key investments, which are probably only a few billion a year, which given that the cost has been trillions, is a pretty good insurance policy. It's to have a well-trained workforce of epidemiologists that are looking at these outbreaks when they're still very small. And you have to have a lot of surveillance. The diagnostic tools have gotten cheaper. They can look for all the different respiratory pathogens. And so we can kind of have a census and see, okay, what's out there that's spreading human to human, and then look and see, okay, is a variant coming up that is causing lots of sickness and lots of death. Now, so we may find that it's a variant of the flu, which has always been scary, or it could be some pathogen that we hadn't identified as super risky, but when we catch it in that surveillance network, we can act to activate diagnostic tools, activate getting the interventions, including vaccines and therapeutics and drugs. So surveillance managed by a team of 3,000 professionals under the WHO, that's kind of the global level investment. Then, for the US, given our incredible expertise in medical innovation, we'll have to devote some of the research budget to these areas, finding a blend of funding academic research and incentivizing the private sector who has a lot of the capabilities, including practical challenges like antiviral libraries, or techniques where you can start to make lots of antibodies in, say, 30 days instead of 6 months. That'll have to be a private public partnership to build up those capabilities that the market doesn't demand, but the private sector skills can help us develop so that it will have a dramatic impact in any future pandemic.
It's such an important point. I remember when we were interviewing Dr. Fauci earlier, and he said, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and science and the private sector will lead the way. And that's exactly what you're saying now. And then I guess it leads me to the next question, which is about climate. You've been studying climate and energy issues for a long time. Your book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, was just released in February. Is the same idea, the same technology and innovation a part of that solution?
Absolutely. There are some things in common. We need government to think ahead to what the bad scenarios are, and then make the right investments. In the case of the pandemic, we didn't see it coming, but once it hits, then you're just seeing, the horrific number of deaths. With climate change, it just gets worse every year. And so the, storm events, the flooding, the crop failures, particularly in the hotter parts of our country, the wildfires. And so it kind of sneaks up on you, but the lead time to fix it is far, far longer than it is to invent a new vaccine, because here with climate, we have an installed base of how we do power generation, how we make cement and steel, how we power our cars and planes and trucks. And every one of those things has to change to a green approach. And when we first go and do that, the extra cost, say for green steel or green cement, it's dramatically more expensive. Although, I absolutely believe with innovation that every one of the categories, that extra cost for green, which I say is the green premium, that can be brought down. Now we need to use all the tools here: R&D for the early stage, venture capital for first commercialization, but then also some degree of purchase requirements or tax credits, money from philanthropists and companies to create a market, to try to get that volume up and create a learning curve so that, there's enough demand for clean, say, aviation fuel, because companies are wanting to offset whatever their employee travel is generating, that leads to more and more capacity and more understanding of how we get that cost to be not much more than or the same as what aviation fuel has cost when we didn't care about the emissions that it caused.
It's so interesting because you think about, we're talking about this once in a century, we hope, global pandemic we're facing. And then we think about this massive challenge of climate change that we were just discussing. And yet we're balancing these investments with a precarious economic recovery. So here we are closing out a global forum with thousands of people from more than 100 countries who've been thinking about how do you have a broad-based recovery, both globally, how do we help different countries along that may be having a harder time up that economic recovery scale, or even within countries, how do we make sure that the most disadvantaged communities are taken care of? So it's just this balancing of short-term problems, long-term problems at a precarious time in our economy. So what are you thinking about this broad-based and global recovery?
Well, sadly, the negative impacts were far worse for the poor countries versus the rich countries, and those who are worse off within the rich countries. They didn't have the internet connection to continue learning. They didn't have the space in the home to get the kind of quiet that a student requires. The schools they attend were much slower to shift over to the online. And so, we're very lucky that to some degree, the macroeconomic environment, allowed in rich countries where the U.S. is actually the largest, allowed us to step up with increased government spending. So if we spend that money well, not only do we take the pandemic deficits, but we take some of the inequities that have always been a concern and start to make some progress towards those. Uh, the actual cost of being ready for the next pandemic is not gigantic. If you look at the precautionary measures where we spend on our defense budget, this won't be more than about 1% of that. Even our overall health research budget, the overall cost of what the US needs to do will be about 10% of that. Climate, on the other hand, the numbers are quite large. If we can create markets and competitive products, it brings that cost down. But the scale of it, all of those industrial factories and the way we do transport and food, it's very tough. And if we go back to 2015, the R&D budgets had not gone up. The venture capital was largely turning away from green things because it realized it's a lot harder than, say, doing a website or software. And so the energy around innovation just wasn't there. That's gotten a lot better recently. The government R&D is going up in this space, including funding new generation of approaches in areas like storage or nuclear. Now, a lot of risk capital, partly because people are dying to get returns. They're willing to bet on even risky technology innovations because they see there'll be demand for the green products. So we made good progress on climate in the last few years. If it wasn't such a gigantic problem, you could say, okay, another decade of great work and we'll be there. Sadly, with this one, because of just the scale, every year between now and 2050, we're going to have the same prioritization and effort that we have. And that's partly why building a consensus around the problem, and even if we disagree about some tactics, that it is a huge priority, that we shouldn't drop it in some of those years, depending on what the political situation is. So I'm excited to see what the field is doing, but we're not one vaccine away from solving climate.
No, fortunately, right? That would be that's a sci-fi movie that we haven't seen yet. I think that we might like to see or like to experience. Going back for a second to the pandemic, one of the things people are talking about is, as at least in the United States, we return to some form of normalcy, if slowly, is okay, well, what has changed and what has changed permanently? So what change came faster because of the pandemic? What changed in terms of, you mentioned, broadband and internet connectivity and the need for that. So what needs have been highlighted? What has changed? What do you think stays changed? And, we have a whole generation of people who are coming of age at a time of a great health and economic crisis combined. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about what could be lasting impacts from this pandemic.
Well, certainly the willingness to do things digitally was forced upon us. And so even the older generation that did very online shopping, had to get used to that as a way of buying. In the past, if a salesperson was going to come and, say they were interested in having you as a customer, their physical presence was kind of a necessary element of seriousness. If somebody had said, "Hey, I'll just show up on your screen," they would have said, "Yeah, well, the serious people are here in person." So as we go back and look at online learning versus in person, or doctors' meetings, for, say, therapy versus in person versus digital, I think we've realized that some part of the activity can be done on a virtual basis. And trying to decide as an employer, hey, do my employees have to be here 2 days a week, 1 week out of 4. If they live far away, are we willing to accommodate that? What's the minimum requirement? I hope people are going to their employee groups and thinking about, okay, there were some benefits to not having that long commute. There were some benefits to be able to hire people who live in different locations, and the cost of real estate, in the cities that are doing well, that became a barrier, particularly for the middle class jobs. And so, I wrote a book 25 years ago that said digital would make the importance of city centers less important. Certainly, up until the pandemic, I was more than wrong. It was the opposite of the truth. A few city centers really thrived at the expense of other locations. And so we're in a very interesting period to take those lessons and, elimination of paperwork and lots of travel, and say, okay, what should the new steady state be? Almost every call I have, people say, hey, I look forward to seeing you in person. But, actually, some of those meetings I don't think need to be done in person. I'm working more with leaders in Africa. We do lots of 20 or 30-minute meetings instead of every couple of years flying in and, because you've gone so far, meeting longer than the true content about improving their health system really would justify. And now, doing it digitally multiple times a year, we only need to talk when there's an issue or, to reinforce some good thing that they're doing. So at least in that example, it's dramatically better than what came before.
It's interesting, right? When we all talk about how we're intentional, does this give us an opportunity to be more intentional with our time, to do more of the A work, the core example you just gave? I think the thing I'm worried we'll lose is serendipity. Do my grandchildren ever have a snow day? Is everything, since you can always be virtual, does it just get harder to turn off if things don't have to be live? So I just want you to know I'm starting a one-woman campaign to preserve the snow day, or something like it. So you just talked about a prediction you made about city centers. You also predicted in 2015 the risk of a global pandemic, and it makes this audience certainly want to hear from you about what you think the risks are that are out there still.
Well, the pandemic risk will always be there. It's actually pretty hard to say what it is per year. And there's two categories. There's natural pandemics, like we're quite sure this one was, and then there's intentionally caused pandemics. And so as we invest, we have to look at both of those scenarios, which, if you're not ready for, the toll can be very horrific. I mean, the death rate doesn't have to be well under 1%. It can actually be with something like the smallpox higher. So not to be super negative, that is a risk area that in some ways this wake-up call will be good for us going into the future. Climate and the great inequity in health around the world, are others that are big for me. The future of Africa in all of these things looms large because that's where you have most of the population growth, and yet it's also where you have the weakest governance, and where climate, if we're not careful, will create massive migration. So, I think it's great people are going to pay more attention to the future of Africa and kind of focus our aid on what seems to work there, including, digital innovations like digital currency to let everybody have a bank account or to track money flows to reduce corruption. I feel like we're all talking about polarization and how we pull together to make our health systems and education systems better. I hope other people have good ideas on that. In the health and climate area, I really do see the innovators, and I can share that I'm optimistic about those things. On coming together politically, I'm hoping there's young people who, figure out how we create a sense of collaboration that sometimes feels pretty weak over the last few years.
Well, I like your optimistic note, and I should let you in there. But I think that idea of science will win, and innovation and technology help, and the private sector will lead the way. I think those are all important themes. We appreciate both you personally working on some of the toughest challenges and biggest risks that are out there, and you sharing your wisdom with us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to talk to you.